Okay, welcome to Promotable. Welcome to Breaking Into Data. I'm Aaron Falus, founder of Promotable, and also, of course, your host for tonight's event. So before we get started, just a couple of quick announcements. So first off, Promotable, we're a workforce accelerator focused on closing those data skill gaps. So if anyone's interested in learning more, we do this through a couple of right ways. Primarily one, events like this, which we do every single week. So tonight we have a really exciting panel. Next week we have ex-director of marketing from Roku. So that'll be really cool as well. So just keep looking at your email and signing up. Last thing, everyone, you guys are on LinkedIn right now anyway. Please give us a like. Those are always appreciated. And then with that, let's dive right into it. I think the first thing to do is let's just kick it off and guys give the audience just a brief intro on who you are, what you do, and then we'll dive into it. We'll start with Shreya maybe.
Okay. Hi. Firstly, thank you, Aaron, for setting up this whole panel discussion. And it's nice to meet you, Alex and Rebecca. And my name is Shreya, and currently I am an analytics consultant at the World Bank. So before I dive into explaining what my job is, I thought I'll just give you a brief of what I do, like what my team does. So my team is the International Comparison Program, or the ICP, at the World Bank. And we produce a measure called the PPPs, or the Purchasing Power Parities. And this is basically an index which compares the cost of a common basket of goods and services across countries or within regions for a particular country. And here is where I fit into my day-to-day job. So what I do here is basically I help in the calculations, I help in the validation of these PPP results, and as well as when the database is done, I help them with data visualization. So yeah, that's about me.
Awesome. Alex, you want to go next?
Hey everyone, great to be here. My name is Alex Pete. I am a business analytics manager at a company called Opportune. It's a consumer lending company that had primarily been focused on people in the Latino community get access to credit. Before that, though, I had been working in a consulting role across the consumer lending industry, working with banks and fintechs and then also investment funds, all focused in the consumer lending space. So that those type of financial products that your everyday customer is typically working with. And with that was doing primarily strategy and analytical consulting. So helping these businesses understand the questions they need to be asking themselves and leveraging the data that they have to then go answer those questions.
Awesome. Very well said. Next, Rebecca.
Hi, so I'm Rebecca. I am an analytics consultant with a growing firm called Acumen Solutions. We focus on a lot of Fortune 500 work, but we also sort of split with government work as well. So a lot of exposure to different types of clients and different types of situations. And I primarily focus on Salesforce, Einstein, and Tableau as far as technologies go. So a little bit of AI and a lot of visualizations.
Well, that was going to be my starter question. So let's just jump into it because I think a lot of folks here, we often get told go learn data skills, go out. I mean, you'll find some sort of job, right? But no one really tells you what kinds of stuff there is, and they assume you have to get the data science title to actually do data work. So I kind of going to go back to you, Rebecca, and kind of I've seen like the analytics consultant title quite a bit. I'm kind of curious. I think the audience is kind of curious what that means and like what kind of stuff do you have to have? Do you have to be an amazing Python coder to do this, or is it more like business skills, or tell us more?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that there's really two major routes. I have a lot of coworkers who did start in data. They have that really strong data science background, like maybe data science adjacent. And then I have another portion of my coworkers who come from a background that's more like mine, which is more business focused. So we have maybe the business analysis experience, we understand the business problems, and we have that sort of acumen. And we sort of, at Acumen Solutions, we usually kind of marry the two together. So you end up with a well-rounded package that understands both your business problem and the questions that you're trying to answer or the questions you're trying to dig deeper on, as well as the technical side between, how do you really get at those questions effectively and efficiently in terms of a solution. So I think that there's definitely entry.
I think we may have lost you there. We'll give her a second. She's back.
Hello, sorry about that.
No, no worries.
So yeah, I came in with a business background side. So I really focus on getting to know a client and the questions that they really need answered to move the needle. I don't have a statistics background or an engineering background or anything like that, but I have some general STEM knowledge enough to get me going.
And so then when you go into a company and you kind of start learning what questions they ask, or what they're looking to find out, then what's the next step for you? Would you like send that off to someone else, or how do you kind of fit in the middle there?
So the next step for me is always to confirm with the client that we're hearing them correctly, right? You always want to make sure that you believe there's a need to answer or investigate this question. You always want to ask in a different way than you've heard it, to make sure that you're truly on the same page about what needs to get done and what's really going to move the needle for you. But once we do that, the next thing that we usually try to do is start mapping out a little bit of what our best case scenario is. So what is it that you truly want way down at the root level? Not necessarily, I want a lawnmower. It's more like, I want the grass mowed, right? So we're trying to really get at the basic thing so that we make sure we give you all the options.
Cool. So guys, while we're going to keep talking for a little bit. I'm going to keep using that moderator's prerogative. But while we talk, feel free to please start putting your questions over into the comment box, and then we'll start getting to them as soon as folks have them. So feel free to get that going, and then we'll just jump in. Next question, going at Alex here, because I think I'd like to start talking about that distinction between what you do, which is business analytics, and kind of like that data science space at large. So could you give us just like a high level of what the difference might be between biz analytics and folks who might focus just on data science, which is very broad, as we talked about before, but I'm just going to kick it off.
Yeah, so the way I typically categorize it in my career is when you start talking about data science, that is a little more, it's more stats oriented, typically a higher degree of stats sophistication. And a lot of it is around building projection models. So consumer lending, for that, a lot of it's risk. When you're talking about marketing, it's how people are going to respond to things. There's a whole variety of different sorts of models that you can build in, but that's typically where I view data science. Business analytics, data analytics is really just using the information that you have available to just drive your strategies and decision making. So that is just, it can be simple things like just doing a test. When you're thinking about something like a user experience, you roll out a feature, you create a test and control group. Half the people can see that feature, half the people can't. How do people's interactions change when they can see that? What does that mean? How should you incorporate that into your business going forward? That's how I bridge the two. Yeah. That's kind of how I've seen it separated out in the industry I work in. I'd love to hear if other people have different experience with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And then before we move on to the next thing, also curious, like who are the stakeholders that you usually work with?
So primarily when I was working in consulting, it was typically C-suite or program directors. And there's quite a bit of range of data knowledge, just people depending on the company and people's backgrounds in particular. So one thing as an analyst is you need to be able to understand people's depth of knowledge and willingness. Willingness is a key piece of it as well, to dig into the numbers and really where they want to spend their time focusing on, and then tailoring your recommendations, your insights to that level of your audience. I think that is one of the most important parts of working as an analyst. That has nothing to do with the actual numbers that you're working.
Awesome. And Shreya, I think you probably have the most, this is the weird way of putting it, but like normal into data. But that said, I think most of the time when people think of folks who do data science, it's like more hardcore coding and you're doing your like a techie, if you will. And I think the work that you do is super interesting. So for the stuff that you do, who two questions, and then we'll get to this lineup of questions that we have here. First question is just, thinking about all the school that you went through, right? You did a full master's degree, and now you've got this really cool sounding job at the World Bank, and maybe that's the poli-sci nerd in me, but what kinds of skills do you actively use versus like stuff that maybe you learned or were told you needed to do in school but isn't as valuable for you now?
I think because the skills which we mostly use are Python. Coding is something which we use a lot in our day-to-day life. Mm-hmm. And it's more about understanding the data, right, for us. So that is one thing which is important. And what we were not taught in school, which we were taught here, firstly was that there's a big data set, which we were given here. Like in school, we were always given data sets which were clean and comprehensive. But over here, we had like large data sets, and we were told how to manipulate data better over here at work. Whereas in like my master's program, it was already clean data given to us where we just had to plug it into a regression model and churn the numbers out. That was the main difference, I would say.
Interesting. Yeah, that seems like something that comes up a lot. Alex or Rebecca, would you say that like the bigger challenges that you guys face, or is it something different for you guys?
I'm sorry, my internet cut out when Shreya was talking.
I'll summarize. Basically, she was mentioning that they learned how to code and this kind of stuff at work or at school, but the biggest challenge that she's facing now, or that kind of you learn on the job, is that the data set that you get in school is like really clean. It's like you go into Kaggle, you download something, and you can plug out all the numbers into the regression and it works out perfectly. Whereas now a lot of the stuff that she gets is, I don't want to say all over the place, but different. You have to kind of clean up that messy data set before you can even think about your problem or digging into it.
Yeah, I would definitely echo that. Yeah, when you learn this stuff in a controlled setting, you get perfect data sets. That's insane. Those don't exist. A lot of time is spent quality controlling your data, understanding why differences exist. I think when you're working in analytics, you constantly need to be applying a critical lens. How could this be wrong? Why does this trend exist? Always make sure to question the narrative around something. So you may see a trend and in your clients, in the business, there's a narrative why you think that trend exists. Don't assume that's the case. Always dive a level deeper into it to understand if that's truly the reason something's happening. I've seen that be a pitfall for a handful of clients in the past. They saw something, it fit with a convenient narrative, but it led them pretty far away from what the real answer was.
Yeah, I definitely hear that. It's one of the things that comes back to me whenever I talk to companies. or people, it's, that concept of, I guess, stakeholder management might be a way of putting it, where what you get asked for isn't necessarily what they actually want. Rebecca, you seem to be nodding a lot. You want to pile on this, and then we'll jump into all these questions. We've semi-answered some of them, but I want to make sure that that we're able to answer everyone's question.
Yeah, so I'm actually going to answer Jennifer's while I'm asking this. So I think the big thing for me, the difference between school and actually applying this, is that when you really get into school, there's usually a right answer, right? And when you try to apply it in the real world, sometimes clients also feel like there's a right answer. And what I really, really love from clients is when they come to me asking questions, right? Not necessarily digging for an answer, but really digging into, can I ask more educated questions, right? Like, tell me what in my data is indicating that I should be investigating something. So for example, I have sometimes salespeople who come to me and they want to know, how great is my performance, right? But on the other hand, the clients that I think get the most out of it are the ones who come and say, okay, I know this is what my sales data sort of looks like, but what can I do to do better? How can I manage my team better? How can I really dig into opportunities to cross-train, to, think outside the box, ask questions that I wouldn't normally?
Yeah, I think that's a good answer. And then Gilbert asked, I assume you're all gonna have probably different answers, but what was the hardest part of, he says breaking into data, but I'd say landing that first data job. Feel free to jump in.
Okay, so I think the hardest part of breaking into data for me was to get rid of the imposter syndrome narrative, right? I didn't have a data science background, and to be frank with you, I really didn't want one. I didn't have that much interest in database or things of that nature, and I have programmed before, but it was a rough time for me. I mean, I'm talking about sitting there with the dictionary of what names mean and turning to somebody else who knows how to program and going, is this what I need to do this or no? And the answer was almost always no. So we got through it, but it was rough. So I think the biggest thing for me with breaking into data was to go and talk to people and have confidence that even though programming wasn't my thing, and even though I didn't have a statistics degree, like I still brought value to the team and I still brought value to the analytics picture. And that is absolutely true. If you are working for a business and you know that business really well, you add value immediately. It does not matter that you don't know how to program or that you don't understand the statistics behind what you're asking. If you know that business really well and you're willing to be patient and sit down and really articulate what you know and dig into that with someone, that's incredibly valuable.
Right. I sort of agree with you, Rebecca, because even for me, I personally feel when you break into data, it's understanding the data, what is the data about, which is the most hardest part, because once you've understood the data and once you've seen what value the data adds to your insights or your decisions, that's like the best thing. And once that's done, everything else just flows automatically into your head. The other thing is also interpreting data, which is kind of difficult because sometimes numbers just come out and that's what differentiates you from everybody else when you're able to sit there and understand and interpret data correctly. So those are the two things which are hardest, but once you get them, everything else is just smooth sailing from them.
Yeah, I think I'll add one last piece, and I think it was something that really helped me along the way. When I was first starting, I had a manager who really emphasized sometimes you have a desire to dive straight into trying to pull data. However, that you end up boiling the ocean and wasting a lot of time that way. One of the most important things is to come up with a detailed and action-oriented analysis plan, which means clearly defining the question you want to answer and then creating steps along the way to both define how you're going to get to that data, and then also check yourself along the way to see where issues may come up, whether it's, if you're manipulating data in some way, sometimes it doesn't always work. Think through how things could look right, but actually be wrong, and check against yourself. And that'll keep you on a path and get you to your answer a lot quicker than if you're just trying to dive into it without really laying that path down first.
Yeah, that's actually a really, really good answer. Also, because it really flows into the next question. JP had a couple of questions, but I think one of the more interesting things that I see is talking about, we always talk about what's good about data, but we rarely talk about what pitfalls to avoid. Things that you're like, oh, that totally makes sense, but then, it's actually an outlier and it's not really relevant. Or something else. So I was curious on two things, and I think Alex, you kind of talked about that kind of balance between like analyzing stuff, but then also action, and by action I mean creating those steps and what that means. But then what kind of pitfalls do you guys see often when you're handed a data set or someone says, look at this? Is there stuff that comes up where you're like, someone who isn't trained might come to the wrong conclusion?
Definitely outliers. That's the first thing. When I look at data, I'll try to make like the basic graph just to see what the data is trying to tell me. And when I see a bunch of outliers in the beginning, before I even analyze, I have an idea about them at the back of my head, whereas somebody else would analyze the data and then will not be aware about these outliers, which will eventually just, the entire analysis will be like horrible. So I think, that's the main thing, like looking at the outliers and looking at the data peculiarities, because each data is different and each data has its own drawbacks. So yeah, that would be my...
Your pitfall. Anyone else have any other stuff to add to that?
I think
I think my piece on this really quick, and it's a short one, but with outliers, also remember your sample size.
All right.
You can jump to the incorrect conclusion if you just look at a small set and there's a lot of randomness in the world, and without sufficient sample, you can take reads and apply them the wrong way. So, I think I mentioned testing earlier. Sample is very important in there. Also controls in your data. So if you're trying to find out something you've built a test, make sure you've designed controls in a way that you have your dependent variable that you can measure, and then have a defined read on, hey, did this thing work or not? That's something I've seen a lot with clients is, oh yeah, we've tested that before, but they didn't design any sort of control. So I'm like, well, you have it really.
Absolutely.
Sorry to cut you off there, Rebecca.
Oh, you're fine. You're fine. I was actually just going to add that I think my biggest thing to kind of complement the outliers is make sure that you're not missing data, because that is just as bad. Having data that is an outlier is one thing, but you definitely need to make sure that, number one, your data is valid, and number two, you're not missing huge swaths, because that really will set you on the wrong track very quickly. And the other thing I would say is that if you come to a conclusion that you didn't expect, that's great. Keep digging. Even if you come to the conclusion that you did expect, keep digging. Sometimes the explanation that you think is obvious is not really what's causing what you're seeing. So definitely don't stop and be satisfied with an answer. That answer should always have another question.
Yeah, that's a very good point. And for folks who want to dive deeper into that, we actually a few months ago had an event just on things to watch out for with data. So we spent a whole hour digging into it. So if anyone wants to dive into our YouTube channel, I'll drop that in the chat later. But some of you may find that interesting. Quinn asked kind of a similar question to the one we heard before, but if there's anything to add, what was the steepest learning curve that you guys had from kind of going from school to work?
I think for me, it was learning how to navigate balancing a client's needs with what you are super excited about in the data. Because sometimes you see things and you're like, this is a huge potential value add. It's going to be awesome. It's going to be great. And then you get into talk to the client about it and they're not as excited because they see maybe the risks or they see experiences they've had in the past where they tried to implement something similar and it didn't go that well. So I think learning to balance like this huge potential exciting thing with the realities that someone has experienced and the value that wisdom brings to the table was a big thing for me. And I think it was a bit of a learning curve, mostly just because it's a soft skill, right? Nobody can teach you that balance. You have to just dig in and figure it out. And it takes some time.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Jennifer asked, do we still use the terms BI, like business intelligence, or big data? I think this is like pretty straightforward in that it's a little broad, but I mean BI is obviously still used. But I'll let you guys take that as well.
Yeah, I mean, so BI, the way I tend to think about it is business intelligence is understanding what is going on in your business. So that is typically a lot of data visualization in my mind. So that is, it's building the reports to understand what are the trends in your business. Now, how that differentiates from analytics for me typically is analytics is then, okay, based on this trend, I have a question, I have a hypothesis. Let's build out some way to then answer that question or test that hypothesis. And that's how you differentiate the two in my mind. Big data, that's just a word people use to sell their products typically.
It's just a buzzword. Yeah. A couple folks asked, so I'm going to try and capture all the questions at once. But it's one of my favorite questions. Where did you always know you wanted to be a data person or be dive into data, or was it a natural progression, or did you pivot from something else? I'm just going to throw this out to the field because I think you guys all have like some very different backgrounds, but all pretty unique.
Yeah, so I would jump in because I've been wanting to be someone who loves data since I would say high school, because I did statistics in my undergrad and in high school. And ever since I was like, because I think this started for me in my household. Most of my household decisions were all data-driven decisions, which were all fact-based. They were like, you can never be questioned if you have data in front of you. And from then I knew from the get-go, like I want to be a data geek. Like that's a term which people use around. So yeah, I think my love for data began very early in life, and hence that's why I wouldn't say I'm from a non-technical background, but with every step I've learned only. So yeah,
relatively straightforward progression.
Yeah, I think I definitely fell into it more, but the reason I fell into it is probably the same reason that Shreya always wanted to do it, is because having decisions that are backed up by things that I can quantify and reason around has always made sense to me. I'd always been kind of quantitatively oriented. I came from a business background in undergrad. I didn't have a strong sense of what I wanted to do. I just mostly knew what I didn't want to do. So that eliminated things, but it didn't really get me anywhere. And I kind of fell into an internship with Capital One, and ended up somewhere where people were super data oriented. Information-based strategy. That's what decides decision making, and you could see the tangible results of this was a good strategy, this was a bad strategy. These are how we measure it, and that just really clicked with me. And I really liked working in that manner. And then there was also like, here's how you apply it in lots of different fashions. So that's how I fell into it. But I think it's liking being able to see the why behind a decision is a lot of the reason I think I ended up in this field.
Awesome.
I'm impressed that your household was data-driven.
It was definitely. Because there's no way of any bias, right? Once you have a data-driven decision made, nobody can change your opinion because you just lay all the facts down. So any decision that is made is always with data, backed with data. Just makes it easier for everyone to come to a collective conclusion.
Yeah, if you like to win, it's always helpful to say, here's what I want, and by the way, here are the 10 reasons why I'm right. So diving in, this is kind of just going off of what we talked about earlier, but is there, thinking about a data set, I think Rebecca, you mentioned like one of the biggest challenges is when you've got data that's missing. Is there a way of like realizing when that's the case? Like, how do you know when you're like, oh, here's why this is not making any sense to me?
So there's a couple different ways I think to test that relatively quickly. If you're using a platform, if you're lucky enough to be using a platform like Salesforce Einstein, it actually tells you, for example, when you're trying to do the AI, it will tell you how well your story has performed. So it will tell you very obviously that something has gone awry and this does not look accurate, or it will tell you if you're overfitting the model. If you've got like 99% accuracy, you know you're in trouble. That's no good. So sometimes you get lucky and platforms just tell you. But if not, I think the easiest kind of entry level doesn't make sense test is just pick a sample of data. Pick a small sample of just the tabular data and start running through and say, does this make sense? You know, if you start finding records that are incomplete or just like have information that obviously conflicts with itself, then you need to start really digging in a little deeper and do a little bit of an audit, which can be a little painful, but is very helpful. And if you know the answer to a question, sometimes that's helpful. Like if I know roughly where my average sales figures are, I can whip up a really fast graph that's just a simple bar graph of like my sales figures. And if I get an answer that's way off of what I expect, then I know I'm probably in trouble.
Fair enough. This next question I think is directed at Shreya, just because they're asking, do you have tips for people who do have those like econ backgrounds who want to get into data roles, but specifically with this World Bank type, but kind of either NGO or policy type organizations versus getting in at Capital One or more business focused?
I mean, the main tip is the background, right? You need to have a solid economics background or just love economics because data is everywhere. But what ties up data is the background you are with. Like, because I'm working at the bank, I had to have an economic background to understand the figures, like, macro level data, micro level data. Otherwise, it would be hard. So one tip would be just to understand, to have an interest in the field, because that's very important, and to understand the key concepts, like the key terms and that everybody throws around in the world, so that will help them. Apart from that, I feel once those two things are done, then it's just data, learning and understanding data and tying them together. So.
Yeah, just understanding the basics of why data is important to the bank versus someone else, and that's just basic stakeholder management and just doing your research. So next question from Timothy Nguyen. He's asking where I don't know if any of you guys have done this yet, but internally from the company, Alex might be the best person for this, but how do you switch from we'll say non-data side to a role that's more data focused? Maybe not, I don't think you did in the title necessarily, but a more analytics focused role. Any of you guys have experience with that?
So not firsthand, but I think probably the first thing is make sure you develop this skill set that is going to be required before trying to make the move. There are a lot of resources, and there's a lot. I'm sure Aaron has a bunch he can point you to. There's a lot of free ones out there. There's a lot of different ways to learn the straightforward technical skills that are going to be on like typically in organizations I've been, there's usually a technical test associated with it. So be prepared to do that. Do your research. Google is your friend when you are beginning to go down this path. If you have a question, someone's probably asked it before, and a lot of times someone's also answered it before. So go deep dive down forums. That's very helpful. But I think making sure that you are prepared from a technical perspective is the first step. And then from there, I think showing an understanding of the business and the role is probably the next vital step for making that switch. So being able to articulate, you understand the business problems, how the business functions, what the key drivers are, where the key areas to focus are. And I think those aspects are also really important when you're in the data and strategy side.
Yeah, sounds like really just honestly putting in the work, really doing that prep, and showing that you can do that job already, rather than kind of waiting for someone else to tap you on the shoulder, and kind of making that initiative, doing a small sample, and then saying, if you give me this job, I could do a lot more. Here's a question. I see this a lot because I see a lot of like not good data science projects. Diego's asking if there is a project in your portfolio or something that you've done that you think set you apart from other candidates, or also now just like when you guys are either hiring or meeting colleagues, is there something where you're like, oh man, like this person, this is something like wow everyone.
This is going to sound weird, but I feel like just asking the right questions on an everyday basis wows a lot of people. It's not necessarily a project, but it's definitely something I've noticed, even when it comes to just interviewing candidates for a role. If you can ask me an intelligent question that it takes me more than a half second to think of an answer to, I like it. That's good. That's just, we're moving in the right direction. So I think that is great. Just really be thoughtful going into a client meeting or a job interview or anything, and really think beforehand about some of the building blocks so you have a good foundation, and give yourself that room to breathe when you get in the room so that you have the time to be able to ask a really intelligent question.
Fair enough. Move Chuck right along here, but Neha asked a question about how important or relevant like online courses and certifications are to break in. I obviously have a very heavily biased answer. Hand it off to you guys as well, but I'll say this. I mean, obviously at Promotable, we have data analytics courses and certificates, but as someone who's also hired a bunch of people, I can say that it's important to have something that shows that you know the skill. But if you just say I have this certificate and then you get in the room and you don't know how it relates to my business, you're one of many people that have a certificate. That doesn't tell me a whole lot. So the real thing, so at Promotable, we focus on that work project so you can show, ultimately, I think it really goes back to what Alex said, kind of doing the work, doing the homework. If you want to work at Starbucks, I want to see you working on a project that's to do with coffee. If you want to go work in retail or CPG, like do something that targets that, so that then you can actually have, to quote Rebecca, an intelligent conversation and ask good questions, or something beyond. Like the last thing anyone wants to see is your Titanic data set. But also like having something that can back you up, I'd say is important. But honestly, if you can answer all the questions without it, no one's gonna say, by the way, we can't hire you until you get a piece of paper. My 2 cents.
Yeah, I agree with that. I have a bunch of certifications and they're great, and I get them because I like them. I like doing certifications. I'm weird, but I don't necessarily feel like I really need those, and I didn't have them when I started. But what I will say is, to build off of what Aaron's saying, it's super important to go in with some knowledge, some hands-on experience that isn't cookie cutter. So go out and find a real world problem. Find a business owner that and ask if you can help them solve a problem. Find a nonprofit that needs help. Find something that you can really truly do, so that you get not only an actual project that you can really speak to in terms of, this is what I did and this is what value that provided, but you also potentially get a great networking connection that can vouch for the great work that you did.
Yeah, actually, and speaking of projects, I think the most important thing is like, yes, relevant to the business you're applying for, but also if it's something you're really interested in, that's not like standard, right? I talked to someone, this was an event, I don't know, 2 months ago or so, and their side project really was, they're a baseball nerd, and they basically created like a Python model to like predict, I forgot exactly what it was, but basically they were like predicting wins or something like that. And that was just something they did for fun, but it really helped them. It added to that certificate. So your certificate, your online course, it might get your foot in the door. It might get you an interview, but then being able to answer questions and show that you can apply this is kind of where that project will shine. But coming down, that's not a real question. So Sanjay is asking, one, if you guys would recommend a good online course, but also just as a beginner, where do you start? If you're just like, I don't know what to do, I don't know where to start, I know it's important, I don't really know why, but I want to do something. What should you do?
I would suggest just go on like Kaggle or go to any platform where you have different kinds of data sets, pick up few data sets and just start looking into that and analyzing it, because you need to start somewhere and only then can you eventually start liking data and breaking into data. So that would be like my starting point. Like just go somewhere, go out there, pick any data set and start analyzing it. Even if it's something as basic as making a bar chart, you did something and you got some result out of it. That would be my 2 cents on this.
And there's a lot of resources out there too, and a lot of platforms. So if you're scared of coding and you don't want to start with that right away, that's totally fine. I mean, I'm saying Tableau and Salesforce because that's what I know, but there's a bunch of platforms out there that help you analyze data, and a lot of them come with free training material and education and data sets and all kinds of really helpful stuff for the purpose of helping you get started and helping you learn. So, I mean, everybody wants you to succeed. So just start looking around and pick something, start somewhere.
Exactly.
Yeah, the data visualization tool is a good piece. It's a way to break in without needing to know the coding. And then it also kind of teaches you the object orientation and like how data feeds into it. And as you learn that inherently is teaching you how to then go pull the data yourself when you get into the coding level. So yeah, that's a great way I've used for people, especially like sales sides and organizations, to interpret and better understand their data.
Yeah, that makes sense. It's one thing where that's come up a few times. If we have an instructor who teaches our data jumpstart class, which is basically an Excel class with pivot tables, but she was really good at Excel, and like the next tool that helped her kind of land that job at the startup, she's at Spot Hero now, but really just Tableau, right? Is kind of doing that biz analytics and then being able to make it pretty and present it to stakeholders for her was something that really put her over the top. So I think the moral of the story here is you want something that differentiates you, whether it's your Excel plus Tableau or Power BI or Chart.io. There's lots of tools. At Promotable, we standardize on Tableau, but at the end of the day, if you can do data viz, it doesn't matter what tool you use. Just use one of them and know how to use it well. And then if I were to recommend something to start with, play with SQL. It's that next thing of saying, hey, if you're that person who is like me, who always has to request the CSV from someone else on your team, if you can learn to pull that yourself and save yourself some time, I always find that be really helpful. This isn't a question, but Gilbert, I love your example of writing a contract to get your PlayStation in 7th grade. So here's a good question from Rob was asking, for in finance, what types of stuff do you guys use machine learning for, aside from fraud detection? Is there any other examples that you can think of that? I know none of you guys are in machine learning as like your full-time day job, but you're just gonna throw out, he's asking for a couple of examples, so I figure we might as well kind of dive into it. Yeah, I think one of the ones that comes up. This isn't in finance, but we have an instructor who's at Northwestern Mutual, and one of the things they use it for is to, of course, there's like fraud detection, so seeing if someone's lying, But also when you're like modeling out your premiums for 30 years out or whatever, that's one example. We've had a previous talk. We had a director from Claire's, the place everyone's probably gotten their first like ear piercing from. And so for him, he basically used machine learning to they essentially predict the next the color of like the next earring that people want to buy, or kind of figure out that next thing so you're ahead of the game versus playing catch up. And okay, looks like we're almost out of questions. One other person asked, where's a good place to start doing projects? We talked about kind of volunteering at a small business. I think Kaggle's a good place if you're seeing what you do. But if there's any other places that you guys have kind of explored in terms of just like, here's a good place to kind of just get started and see what's there and do that Titanic dataset project and then go find something that's more interesting. I'm not sure if you guys have any other recommendations on that front.
I think so. There are several websites. I think one of them is Volunteer Match that actually will post projects or nonprofits that need help. And there are usually quite a few data-related projects. So I think that would be I'm actually working on a project right now to connect pro bono talent with startups and startup-like nonprofits. So hopefully soon there will be more opportunities to do that. But in the meantime, I think, the volunteer websites and potentially even your work. I know my work does some substantial pro bono projects every year, and they definitely look for people to stretch into new roles in those projects.
That's actually a really good point. We talked a lot about like how do you transition internally. One of the things that comes up a lot is folks will kind of tap into something and say, oh, I'm on like this board, or I'm taking an initiative to do this, and they really want to see that stuff. So Jennifer, that website, Volunteer Match, right?
I think so, yeah.
Volunteermatch.com. I've seen it as well. It's for everything. So not just data science projects. It's like every single nonprofit that has no budget but needs to do a lot of stuff. And there's like some really cool stuff on there. I know I've had some really good conversations. And if you have the time, you have 5 hours a week or whatever it is. It's well worth it. Honestly, the more stuff you can put on your resume and can actually show results, I think the better off you'll be.
And I promise you that if you are offering free data services, someone will on it pretty quickly.
Yeah, they're not going to say no. Well, I think we've got time for maybe one more question. If anyone has it, we'll give everyone a couple minutes here. Otherwise, if anyone has anything else to add to any of the stuff we've already said, you guys can feel free to join in. Here we go. Oh, there it goes. Someone put it on there. Thanks, Jennifer. Well, awesome, guys. Thanks for showing up. Thanks for coming. I promised everyone that I'd get you guys out by 7 Central, 8 Eastern. So we'll take up that full hour. But thanks again for coming. And for our guest speakers, we can't clap like we would in person, but I just tapped the clap button on LinkedIn a bunch of times. So hopefully that works. For everyone else who's on LinkedIn, please go ahead and slap the like button because that's always helpful for us. Yes, feel free to put in, oh, there you go. Someone else got Volunteer Match. Absolutely. And with that, tune in for us next week as well. That'll be a really cool event coming up. Anyone, especially if you're in the marketing space. But one of the things that we talked about earlier was learning how to ask that question. And that's one of those things that we'll be talking about. And so with that, we're gonna sign off, but feel free to reach out to us. I'm just going to drop my email here. If anyone has any questions, feel free to reach out. And then we'll be posting this talk on our YouTube channel, so you'll all get an email after this as well with that. So thanks again, and we'll see you next time.